Good afternoon, everybody. Today we have assembled here to have an online training on critical care management of patients. All of you are aware that the number of deaths have doubled in the last 1 week. We are now touched almost 13 deaths today, and this is a cause for concern. If all of you can analyze the neighboring state who have got more positive cases than us, the number of deaths is very less. So there's something that if you can do, and how to manage such critical cases is what is all our concern. We should at least try to identify these cases much earlier and do our best so that the patients don't get into ICU or even for that matter for a ventilator, and then prevent deaths. And more than 50% of the deaths are happening from North Karnataka. This is what was a concern. So the government of Karnataka insisted that there should be a repeat training for all the doctors from North Karnataka. There is especially Gulbarga division and Belgaum division. With that, keeping that in mind, we have now arranged this program. And today we have with us the subject experts from different institutions of Rajiv Gandhi University of Health Sciences. Dr. Shashi Bhushan will be the moderator. Then Dr. Uma Maheshwari, Professor and HOD from St. John's Medical College. She'll be talking to us on clinical case management of COVID-19 cases. Then Dr. Bhuvana from St. John's, Dr. Sudesh and Dr. Vijay Kumar from BMCRI will be addressing the critical care, including ventilation and other issues. I'm sure we have a very limited crowd today. We have focused, the participants are only from Gulbarga division and Belgaum division. I'm sure all of you would go through this presentation, and at the end of that, we would urge you to ask some questions, clear all your doubts in the management of these cases. Even if further you have any other doubts, there will be guidance from Bangalore any point of time. The whole idea is to exercise is to see that the mortality is reduced to a great extent. So with that opening remarks, I'll invite Dr. Shashi Bhushan to take over and conduct the proceedings.
Good afternoon, everybody. Dr. Shashi Bhushan, Professor in Pulmonary Medicine, Victoria Hospital. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Sachidananda, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Rajiv Gandhi University of Health Sciences, Karnataka, for giving us this opportunity for this online training. We'll be talking today on discussion on clinical case management COVID-19 by Dr. Uma Maheshwari. She is Professor HOD, Department of Pulmonary Medicine, St. John's Medical College. She'll be dealing with what clinical presentation her patient presents and how to go about on regarding the medical management. Over to Dr. Uma.
I thank the Rajiv Gandhi University for giving us an opportunity to train all of you. Most of you will already be aware from the extensive dissemination of guidelines. This is a reinforcement session. All of us are learning, and let's learn and defeat the virus together. So my 15 to 20 minute talk will center around clinical management of COVID-19 infection, where I would be going through a few case definitions and also at the various clinical presentations of COVID-19 and how to manage it in a non-ICU setting. The brief overview of my talk is a couple of slides about the virus, the timeline, clinical manifestations, where I'll talk about case definitions and severity criteria, how do we manage uncomplicated and mild cases, and when do we escalate care? That's probably the most important, because mild cases would recover. We need to identify those borderline cases who may deteriorate in the hospital or the ones which present with severe respiratory failure to the emergency room. So they become the most important subset to cater to prevent mortality. And of course, in stable patients and shift outs from the ICU, when do we actually decide to discharge and how long do we follow up these patients? So a brief touch on the timeline. This virus was identified first at the end of last year. That's why the name 2019, though we are in 2020 now. It was first christened the nCoV or SARS-CoV-2 in the first week of January and was renamed as COVID-19 in mid-February and was declared a public health emergency at the end of January. The current status as of 9 o'clock today morning, India has crossed over 11,000 cases with 279 cases in Karnataka and death of 12 out of the 279 cases with 80 who have been cured and discharged. Now coming to the virus, this virus is an RNA virus. If you look at the description here, you have the nidovirales order where you have the alpha, beta, gamma, and delta viruses. The human coronavirus falls in the alpha and the beta subtypes, out of which the SARS-CoV or COVID-19 is a beta virus. Why is it called corona? It's because of its phenotypic appearance under the electron microscope. The top figure is the electron microscopic picture, and the lower one is a schematic cartoon. It's a medium-sized enveloped positive-stranded RNA virus with a crown-like appearance or spikes on the electron microscope. It has one of the largest known viral RNA genomes. The genome, which you can see in the center, is encased in a nucleocapsid and surrounded by the so-called spikes, which surrounds the genome. So I won't go into too much about how the virus invades and causes infection because we need to concentrate on clinical presentation and management here. Now coming to clinical manifestations, most of us know, we've heard it over and over again, but when it really comes out of the patient's mouth, it's a garble of a lot of symptoms. We have to tease out and figure out whether it's really the coronavirus and whether we need to swab or sample this patient. But with testing criteria getting gradually relaxed, we might be able to, after all, sample a good proportion of the influenza-like illnesses. Now coming to modes of transmission, probably the first jump from the animal kingdom to the human beings occurred at the open seafood market in Wuhan, China, as all of us know. Now person-to-person transmission is mainly through droplets and fomites. That's why the emphasis on hand washing, surface cleaning, wearing gloves, personal protective gear and other things, other than the droplets which come through coughing. The virus can survive in infected humans for up to 5 weeks after infection, has been shown to have a maximum of 37 days. Again, this is important to us as healthcare providers because we need to know how long to quarantine the patient after they have symptomatically improved, or those who are at home care, how long do they have to really stay inside without coming into social contact. The modes of transmission as listed here, it can spread through coughing. Coughing usually generates big droplets which travel less than a meter. That's why the definition of close contact as face-to-face contact less than a meter. Airway procedures and nebulizations, like most of you might be performing in critical care, generate aerosols which are smaller than, there's a typo there, it's smaller than 5 microns and they can spread wider. So we have to be careful in critical care settings, especially about aerosol spread. That's why the caveats about use of non-invasive ventilation, the type of interface, use of nebulizers, and the emphasis on use of inhalers with spacer instead of nebulization. And of course, contact spread for the general public, for healthcare workers, it's very, very important. Very vigorous surface cleaning, hand washing, and prevention of contact spread is important because as you can see on the cartoon to the right side, the virus lasts in air for 3 hours. Copper is slightly more, 4 hours. But if you look at commonly used stuff like paper and stainless steel, between 1 to 3 days, and plastic, about 3 days. So again, the kind of advice you would give to your patients, the kind of precautions you would follow in the hospital to prevent contact spread, you need to know the lifetime of the virus on various surfaces. Now, how contagious is COVID-19? There's a concept in epidemiology called the R0, which is the basic reproduction number. It indicates how many people each infected person will in turn infect. If you look at COVID-19, the R0 is 2.8, which means each infected person has a potential to infect up to 3 people, and case fatality is about 3.4%. If you look at all the other seasonal influenza and SARS viruses, COVID-19 probably spreads a lot more, but the case fatality is lower, and it's in our hands to bring it further down by timely recognition of complications. Now, moving on to definitions. Most of us don't like definitions even when we study, but then we'll try and make it easier by going through it together in a kind of group study. So who is a COVID-19 suspect? I'm sure most of you are familiar. Any person with an acute respiratory illness of any degree of severity. Now, these criteria keep changing, who within 14 days before onset of illness has had one of the following exposures. So either they have been in close physical contact with a confirmed case of infection, a healthcare worker, or they have had travel. Again, I'll define close physical contact in the next slide. So a history of travel was also included earlier, but now with the lockdown being put in, international travel will probably translate to local travel, mass gatherings, and other things. Now, who is a close contact? So it stands to sense that somebody living in the same household as a COVID-19 patient is a close contact. Healthcare associated exposure. This is very important where all of us are concerned. Anyone providing direct care for COVID-19 patients with inadequate or breached PPE. That's why it's very important to don personal protective equipment when we go in close contact with a COVID patient, especially if we are going to handle the airway. Also, working with healthcare workers infected with COVID-19. That's why many workplaces have made screening with thermometers mandatory in some places on a daily basis to pick up early signs. Visiting patients, this is where the community health department comes into play. Quarantine patients being visited by community health workers and faculty or staying in the same close environment of COVID-19 patients. All this qualifies as a close contact. Why do we need to know? Because if you're running a fever clinic, you'll have hundreds of people coming in. You need to know where to apply this filter and swab the patient. Although we have expanded facilities for testing for COVID-19, if we end up testing all the wrong people, we will not have test kits left. So we have to apply some clinical filters before we actually decide to test people. Also working, traveling together or sharing the same classroom in close proximity. That's why the importance of social distancing. Face-to-face contact within a meter with a COVID-19 patient becomes an important definition for a close contact. Now, this is another thing which field workers and people in tertiary care hospitals have to know. Not everyone announces that they have COVID. Not everyone announces that they have undertaken travel or that they have been in contact with a COVID patient. They may not even know if the asymptomatic contact or the mildly symptomatic contact has not come to medical attention. So in this context, the definition of SARI or severe acute respiratory illness becomes very important. It's an acute respiratory illness with a history of fever or measured temperature more than 38 degrees and cough, which has come on in the last 10 days and has required hospitalization. Many of you might ask me, can't community-acquired pneumonia present like this? Not all SARI is COVID-19, but then again we have to apply filters to this definition to check which patients with SARI need to be actually sampled. So when do you suspect COVID-19 in a patient with severe acute respiratory illness? A patient requiring admission with no other known etiology that explains the clinical presentation of fever, infiltrates, respiratory failure, not explained with bacteria, not explained with mycobacteria, not with anything else, not left ventricular failure, then you have to suspect COVID-19. If there is a history of international travel, again, these guidelines, I mostly stuck to the Government of India guidelines. Again, with the lockdown, the history of travel recedes to the background, but then travel to neighboring areas or to hotspots would become very important. Also, travel within the city to hotspots, the workplaces becomes very important. Disease occurring in a healthcare worker who has been working in an environment where other patients with SARI are being treated, or an unusual or unexpected clinical course. You might be seeing a case of community-acquired pneumonia, which you thought was going well, but there is a sudden change in the turn of events, sudden deterioration. We are all learning the virus. We are all learning its manifestations. The typical is ARDS, but we don't know whether it can occur as a concurrent infection. So any unexpected turn in a patient with SARI, it's always safe to sample the patient and rule out COVID-19. Now, coming to the clinical presentation, we probably will move from the mild, which gives us a lot of succor, to ones which are very severe, which will be dealt with by my colleague. The symptoms, again, this is from the WHO China Joint Commission. Most people present with fever, almost 88% present with fever. Dry cough is another very important symptom. Non-specific symptoms like malaise may also be present. A history of sore throat, though it is emphasized a lot, in this series it was only about 14%. So just about everything can happen. And again, there are clusters where one symptom takes precedence over the others. So that's why based only on symptoms, we cannot suspect. We probably have to look at contact history, travel history, predisposition, and then put the symptom filter. So basically on a patient who arrives, you're applying multiple invisible clinical filters to decide whether this patient merits to be sampled or isolated for COVID-19. So having said that, fever, dry cough, sore throat, diarrhea, we do know that in certain states in India, diarrhea is a presenting manifestation. So we can't really stick to these numbers in a particular cluster, but we need to know the list in addition to the other risk factors may predispose them. Now, what about the spectrum? Why are we really so worried about the infection? One, we realize that it's very, very transmissible or contagious. Every infected individual can infect about 3 to 4 other infected people. But how exactly does it manifest, and why is it that it's so widespread? The answer lies here. You can see that about 81% of infections are mild. Only about 14% are severe, and about 4.7 to 5% of infections are actually critical. So based on this, again, all our knowledge is based on study of illness in other parts of the world. And we need to extrapolate and find out if our patients are behaving differently. But in the first place, we need to recognize which end of the spectrum they fall into. The numbers come later. So in an uncomplicated illness, patient is mildly symptomatic. They could have mild pneumonia, which means infiltrates have started coming. A severe pneumonia where infiltrates are thrown in with features of slight respiratory failure. And then it moves into the severe spectrum, which includes ARDS, sepsis, and septic shock. Now, when we talk of uncomplicated illness, looks like any other common cold with fever, cough, sore throat, nasal congestion, malaise, headache, maybe diarrhea. But the elderly and immunosuppressed may present with atypical symptoms. So this is where, after the travel history, the contact history, the symptoms, the next filter we have to apply is this patient predisposed to developing from an uncomplicated to a severe COVID infection? So that's where we have to keep our antennae up, because an elderly patient might have got it from an asymptomatic or a mildly symptomatic younger person at home, but may manifest with very bad symptoms. So it's basically the interaction between the patient's immune system and the virus. It's a function of the viral load that the patient gets. So elderly and immunosuppressed may present with atypical symptoms, they may behave differently, and they may progress faster. In an uncomplicated illness, there are no signs of dehydration, sepsis, or shortness of breath. So this could be your common garden fever clinic patient whom you send off with a prescription. But without the contact history and other things which I told you, you might not ask them to quarantine themselves. They may go out and infect a few elders who may actually behave worse than the youngsters. If someone progresses to mild pneumonia, they have clinical features of pneumonia. And in a child, what is called non-severe pneumonia, which again goes by classical definitions of acute respiratory illness in children. A faster respiratory rate is a known thing in children, but it should be coupled with other things to call it a severe pneumonia. When somebody has a severe pneumonia in an adult, usually the patient has signs of respiratory distress. They're using accessory muscles, they're sweating, they're not able to speak in full sentences, they have a high respiratory rate, more than 30 per minute, and their saturation is less than 90% on room air. In a child, on the other hand, the child may have, I told you, even in mild pneumonia, a higher respiratory rate, but in addition would have central cyanosis, chest indrawing, grunting, signs of pneumonia with inability to thrive, breastfeed or drink, unconsciousness, or even convulsions. Other signs of pneumonia may also be present in a child. So the criteria are slightly different, but what you need to understand is that there are lesser criteria in the adults where you know that the respiratory rate is high, saturation is low, and patient is visibly distressed while talking or trying to communicate with you. Whereas in a child, there may be subtle signs like inability to feed or drink, and the child may be lethargic. The last thing in the spectrum is severe or complicated illness, which can present as ARDS, sepsis, or shock. I won't go too much into definitions of these illnesses, as Dr. Bhuvana will be covering it in her presentation. Now, who gets predisposed? Again, I think I've repeated this twice or thrice. Elderly, people who are residents of long-term care facilities, where again there'll be cohorts of people with a lot of predisposing conditions, patients with comorbidities like diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, those with an underlying chronic respiratory disease like severe asthma, COPD, or interstitial lung disease, those who are immunocompromised, either due to illness or due to intake of immunosuppressant drugs, can also obviously progress to severe illness. Now I'll run through the slide. Acute respiratory distress syndrome, all of us know. We define it by onset, origin of edema, and oxygenation. The last criteria becomes very important, where you use a parameter called the PaO to FiO2 ratio in adults. My colleague will deal with this. When PaO2 is not available, this is again when you cannot do an ABG analysis, an SpO2, that is a pulse oximeter saturation, divided by the fraction of inspired oxygen, is an acceptable alternative, and a ratio less than 315 of the SpO2 by FiO2 suggests ARDS. In a child, criteria are again different. We use something called the oxygenation index and the OSI, where the saturation is used instead of the arterial PaO2 levels. Again, I won't go into too many details here. And those who progress into sepsis, when you say ARDS, it's basically a very robust and unwanted immune response in the lung, causing flooding of the alveoli. But when it actually progresses to sepsis, the inflammation is spilling over and causing effects systemically as well. So in adults, you'll have life-threatening organ dysfunction caused by dysregulated host response to the proven or suspected infection with signs of organ dysfunction. In children, again, the criteria are different. And when sepsis goes unheeded, or sometimes you might have a patient presenting to you with septic shock, with persisting hypotension despite volume resuscitation, requiring pressors to maintain the mean arterial pressures. And in children, again, there is a set of criteria to call it septic shock. Suffice it to say that in the severe end of the spectrum, it can be lung limited, it can spill over to the systemic circulation with early signs of organ failure, or can present with septic shock. Now, having learned this spectrum, how do we manage COVID positive patients? So very important for every healthcare provider is to triage these patients. So what do we do when we first see a COVID patient? Within a hospital, it's a good idea to screen all walk-in patients for respiratory symptoms, because you don't know where it's lurking, and you certainly do not want these ill patients or potentially contagious patients to be mingling with your other patients who may have chronic diseases. So screen all walk-in patients for respiratory symptoms prior to entry into the general outpatient area. Provide a face mask or cloth to these patients. This is what we do in our hospital. They are screened, provided a face mask, and there are designated separate screening areas for respiratory symptomatics which are away from the general OPD. And there is also a designated separate emergency room, isolation ward, and ICU, again, so that intermingling and intra-hospital outbreaks don't happen. So where do you admit patients? Uncomplicated illness can be managed at home, or if there is a COVID isolation ward. But again, guidelines say that if you have swabbed a patient for suspected COVID, it's a good idea to keep in hospital till the report comes out. One report negative does not mean no COVID, but at least you can send them home for home quarantine. Somebody with mild illness obviously can get admitted in a COVID isolation ward. Again, in our setting, we have a suspect area and a confirmed area, where anybody who's swabbed first gets admitted in the suspect area, and after receipt of report, either moves into the confirmed area or into a general ward or into home quarantine. Severe pneumonia needs admission into a high dependency or intensive treatment unit where oxygen supply is available and patient has to be closely monitored. And what do we do with respect to uncomplicated disease, with respect to pharmacological management? First of all, isolate the patient. Counsel the patient about symptoms of worsening, because you would not be able to allocate too much manpower into a COVID ward where people just have fever and a few symptoms. Symptomatic treatment with paracetamol, hydration, antibiotics if clinically indicated. And we also should know that when people are being swabbed, they are being checked for influenza as well. So if they are influenza, then it's better to start directed treatment like oseltamivir. If the patient is already on certain medications, earlier there was concern about the use of ibuprofen, the use of ACE inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blockers. Now the emerging studies show that they can be safely continued. Immunosuppressive or immunomodulatory agents, the decision to continue should be made on a case-by-case basis. What do we do in hospitalized patients? Once they are in hospital, remote or periodic management of vital parameters is very important. Certain basic investigations like chest X-ray, blood investigations, and relevant microbiological tests need to be carried out. And some commonly observed abnormalities are lymphopenia, elevated transaminases, and ferritin levels. If they are progressing to multi-organ dysfunction or in pre-renal failure, you may have deranged RFT. When do you discharge patients? You discharge them when there is clinical and radiological improvement, viral clearance from respiratory samples. Now, this becomes very important. We need to sample twice, at least 24 hours apart, and must test negative. In a critically ill patient, although there are no specific guidelines, multiple samples should test negative before the patient can be considered for stepping down. So this is a simple algorithm which says that if a suspect case arrives in your OPD, you send clinical samples to test. If it's negative, the discharge gets governed by the clinical feature of the patient. If the test is positive, they have to go through the management protocol, which I outlined. Choose the admission area, choose the modality of management, choose the modality of monitoring this patient, and decide when to escalate care. If a patient has severe pneumonia, to recollect again, somebody with a respiratory rate of more than 30 in respiratory distress with a saturation of less than 90%, we can give oxygen supplementation through face mask. The guidelines say 5 to 15 liters. I would go a little more conservative. The moment you reach 6 to 7 liters, it's better to trigger the ICU shift out or a HDO shift out at least. Your target SpO2 should be more than 94%. Fluid should not be given ad libitum because you're dealing with a leaky lung and a very robust systemic immune response with a lot of permeability, vascular permeability increasing. So too much fluids are dangerous. Close monitoring and escalate care if there is no response to the above measures. When do you transfer to the ICU? Anybody with acute respiratory illness, that is fever, cough, tachypnea, with an oxygen saturation of less than 90, a chest X-ray showing infiltrates with any of the filters, like a travel history, attending a mass gathering, close contact with a proven case, or if it's a healthcare personnel, managing severe acute respiratory illness cases when they become symptomatic. This can happen when they are presenting to you in the ER, or they may deteriorate in the ward. So these are the red flags or the signals which should initiate a transfer to or escalating care or transferring to the ICU. So most of my references are from the Government of India. There is for practitioners who can attend online courses, there is a website igot.gov.in where there are online training modules which you can actually take at your own pace and try to understand. Most of what I said is from there. The third reference which I stated has a compendium of all the clinical guidelines, including for paraclinical personnel, laundry, management of dead body and other things. That's also on the ministry website. So with that, thank you and stay protected.
Thank you, Dr. Uma Maheshwari, for an excellent talk. We'll be taking questions, or you can put your questions in the outbox in the last. I just want to tell that this session is recorded. So in case you want for the future references, you can get it from the Rajiv Gandhi University website. And on and off photos will be taken during this session. Next session is by Dr. Bhuvana Krishna. She is Professor HOD, Department of Critical Care Medicine, St. John's Medical College. She'll be talking to you on critical care, including ventilation of COVID-19. Over to Dr. Bhuvana.
Very good afternoon to one and all. Dr. Roma has covered most of the patients who will present with COVID-19 infection to the ward. So we may not know if the patients are COVID-19 proven or suspects, but still some of our patients, as Dr. Uma has mentioned, 4.7% of the patients are critically ill and they may land up in our ICU, where you may need to manage these patients. So what is the criteria for ICU admission of COVID-19 patients? Just a recap of what has already been mentioned. A SARI or severe acute respiratory illness is any patient with fever and cough and breathlessness. They have persistent tachypnea, respiratory rate more than 30 per minute, and or oxygen saturation of less than 90% in room air, with or without a radiological X-ray showing bilateral interstitial infiltrates, which may be suggestive of a viral pneumonia or ARDS. Such patients with a COVID suspect or a COVID proven may land up to the ICU. And very important points that we need to note are, you should be able to rule out all other causes that could explain this clinical presentation, like if there is a bacterial pneumonia or influenza. So you will be sending cultures and tests for these. Pulmonary edema. So if you have an echocardiography assessment, it will help you in ruling out etiology of pulmonary edema. ARDS due to other reasons. If the patient presents with pancreatitis trauma, which can present with ARDS, you may have to rule out probably this patient is not a COVID. It could be explained by pancreatitis trauma or other reasons. But yes, we can have a concurrent infection with COVID-19 in these patients also. Some of our patients who are immunocompromised, they may present atypically. These are some things that we need to keep in mind. So recap of definition of ARDS. This is available in all websites and articles. The Berlin definition is what we use to define ARDS. It's very important to note that time within 1 week of a clinical insult, that is within 1 week of the acquirement of the viral infection. Chest X-ray shows bilateral opacities not explained by other causes like effusions, lung collapse, or nodules. The origin of edema should be non-cardiac. And the oxygenation, based on the oxygenation, you can divide the ARDS into mild, moderate, severe. Mild is, here your PaO2 is nothing but your arterial oxygen level of your ABG, arterial blood gas that you do. The PaO2 is, you get the value from that. The FiO2 is, you will have to calculate the FiO2. If the patient is already on the ventilator, you will get the fraction of inspired oxygen. But if the patient is on mask oxygen, you will have to calculate for the mask oxygen based on how many liters per minute you're giving. So based on that, you can classify as mild if the PaO2 is more than 200 but less than equal to 300. Moderate is anywhere more than 100 and less than equal to 200. And severe ARDS where your PaO2 FiO2 is less than equal to 100. In all these settings, a very important inclusion in the criteria is PEEP. The PEEP has to be more than equal to 5 centimeters of water. So having said the definition of ARDS, and you have a patient who is landed in the ICU and you are taking care of the patient, it's very, very important that as an ICU healthcare worker, you need to properly don yourself before entering into your ICU. So the requirement for personal protective equipment are, ICU is an aerosol generating high risk area. So you need to have a waterproof long sleeved apron. You need an N95 mask, you need gloves, you need a cap or a hood, goggles to protect your eyes. And if you're going to do any aerosol generating procedure, you need even a face shield. Aerosol generating procedure, I mean during intubation, suction, bronchoscopy, or even sampling for an endotracheal aspirate. It's very, very important that you have a separate area or COVID ICU where you need to isolate these patients from the rest of the ICU patients. Preferably negative pressure rooms. I'm sure most of the ICUs don't have this facility for a negative pressure rooms. If you don't have negative pressure rooms, you should have an air-conditioned room with at least 10 to 12 air exchanges. If this criteria is not met, you will probably have a well-ventilated room with good cross-ventilation and good spacing between the beds is sufficient to manage these patients in the ICU. So how do you manage a hypoxemic COVID-19 patient in the ICU? So you will start off definitely with oxygen therapy through a face mask and target a saturation of more than 90%. Better to use low flow rates, as mentioned in our guidelines, at 6 liters per minute, because that will reduce your aerosolization. But if the need is more and you need to give higher flow rates, your patient is going to produce more aerosolized material. So better to avoid going too close to this patient and have probably in an isolated area. Switch on to a non-rebreathing mask if the need of your flow rates requirements are much higher. Avoid nebulization because this is another aerosolizing procedure. Use metered dose inhaler with the spacer. This will avoid aerosolization. keep 2 large bore IV cannula on the patient. As already mentioned by Dr. Uma, these patients can go quickly into sepsis and septic shock. Your ICU should have pulse oximetry monitoring, ECG monitoring, and blood pressure monitoring. A wall-mounted suction support or a portable suction support is necessary, and a standby ventilator, because these patients who are coming to the ICU may quickly deteriorate, needing airway assistance with ventilator need. The doctor in the ICU should be airway skilled, because in need, he will need to pitch in to intubate, and you cannot have a resident or a doctor who's not skilled with airway. In the ICU, you need an airway skilled doctor. So when do you intubate? When do you plan to intubate? When there is a rapid progression over hours, or there is lack of improvement on high flow oxygen rates, and you're giving a fraction of inspired oxygen more than 60%, with a persistent hypoxia, that is saturation less than 90%. Most of our patients rarely complain of respiratory distress. It's only the screen which keeps telling you that the patient is hypoxic. Or if you have an arterial blood gas monitoring, you can see a serially evolving hypercapnia. Or when there is hemodynamic instability or multi-organ failure, you intervene early, you intubate early, and do not delay intubation. So what about the role of non-invasive ventilation and high-flow nasal cannula oxygen therapy in COVID-19 patients? There has been a lot of controversy in both these oxygen delivery devices because of the concern of aerosol generation with both these methods. It has been mentioned that with our present non-invasive ventilator with a good face mask, and if you use our ICU ventilators with a filter, you could probably use non-invasive ventilator. High-flow nasal cannula in an isolation room, both NIV and high-flow nasal cannula in an isolation room is preferable, because both of these are aerosol generating procedures. Advisable only in mild ARDS, not in moderate and severe ARDS. We need to closely monitor for hypoxia and respiratory distress. If any of these sets in, or if the patient's respiratory distress doesn't resolve over a period of 1 to 2 hours, please do not delay intubation, intervene early. The maximum number of mortality is because of the delay in intubation. We get a wrong feeling of comfort that we have put a patient on a non-invasive ventilator or high-flow nasal cannula and the patient is safe. That is where we err. So this is our intubation protocol that we have put in our institute. We have a checklist. We see what are the instruments that we have: plexi-tip scopes 3, 4, conventional scope. If you are comfortable with a video laryngoscope, please use a video laryngoscope. Use a stillet with endotracheal tube, because we need rapid intubation to reduce the number of attempts. An ambu bag with a PEEP valve with a reservoir connected with oxygen. You see if the suction is working. The ventilator is checked and put on CPAP with pressure support mode to give mask ventilation. Attach an ETCO2 to confirm the position. If you're not using an ETCO2, you will have to do auscultation method to confirm the position. Keep the ventilator connected with the HME filter, the catheter mount ready, so that once the patient is intubated, you connect the ventilator and then start the ventilator. So the drugs that are recommended can be any of the usual drugs: etomidate, ketamine, succinylcholine, rocuronium. An easy rule that we have formulated is the 100 rule. Ketamine, choline, rocuronium, and fentanyl are 100. So load noradrenaline and keep, because these patients during induction, they can go into shock. So you may need to start noradrenaline during your intubation, and keep your sedation prepared, because the moment you have intubated and the patient is hypoxic, you will need to start deep sedation so that your ventilator can achieve the targets. Monitor has to be switched on and everything has to be checked before you go on to intubate the patient. Keep minimum number of people in the room for intubation. The personnel required for intubation should be minimum of 3. 1 doctor, 1 nurse to give drugs and instrument, and 1 nurse for suction. The nursing staff checks the IV patency, connects fluids, and keeps the other drugs ready. The doctor has a plan for rapid sequence intubation. Pre-oxygenate with bag mask or CPAP with NIV mask with 100% FiO2. Some of the important precautions that you need to take during intubation, ideally in a negative pressure room with minimum personnel. A fully donned healthcare worker with face visors, as it is aerosol generating procedure. Intubating hood, as shown in the picture. If you have it and you are comfortable with the intubation with an intubating hood, you can use. After intubation, inflate the cup and then only switch on the ventilator. This will reduce your aerosolization. Closed suction only to be used, and avoid any disconnection in the circuit after intubation. Shock management, shock definition has already been described. Myocardial dysfunction is noted to be common in these patients. They have very labile blood pressures. You have to be very cautious in fluid administration. If you are comfortable with using the ultrasound for assessing fluids, please continue to use it. If you're not comfortable, use your regular methods that you use for fluid assessment. Avoid unnecessary administration of fluids, as already been mentioned. It worsens hypoxia because your lungs are leaky. Vasopressors to be started in case of shock. Preferable vasopressor of choice is noradrenaline, which is easily available. The dose is our regular dose, nothing special in these cases. And keep a target map of more than equal to 65 millimeters of mercury. Have a serial check of lactate levels if you have the facility, which will also help you which will give you a picture of your perfusion of your tissues. So mechanical ventilation, this I have taken from our ARDSNet protocol. It is freely available. Please refer to it. Mode is assist control mode. See the ventilator that you have in your hospital. What are the modes that are available? Assist control mode. Another name is IPPV or volume control. These are the different names you could use. If some people want to use pressure control mode and you're comfortable with the mode, please go ahead and use. Start with 100% oxygen saturation. You will need to calculate the predicted body weight for the patient, which is what is mentioned in the ARDSNet protocol. These are the two formulas that are there. You start with the tidal volume anywhere between 6 ml per kg is what is mentioned, but the range will be from 4 to 8 ml per kg. You set the initial rate to the baseline. You will have to know what was the patient's baseline minute ventilation and set the rate accordingly. The rate should not be more than 35. You adjust the tidal volume and the respiratory rate to achieve the pH and plateau pressure goals, which I will be coming for. To achieve your ventilation goals, you will need to deeply sedate the patient. You see what is your commonly used sedative drugs. What are you comfortable? Is it one of the opioids, fentanyl or morphine? Or is it midazolam? Be cautious with midazolam and propofol because it can cause hypotension. But if that is what is available in your facilities, please go ahead and use. You will need deep sedation in order to ventilate these patients with ARDS. And if required, neuromuscular blocking agent infusion is also necessary. Whichever is available at your institute, it could be a vecuronium or atracurium infusion. So what are the goals? So the goals are going to be plateau pressure goals. So you will have to measure plateau pressure every 4 hourly. How do you measure the plateau pressure? In a deeply sedated patient, you give an inspiratory hold. You will have to figure out on your ventilator, where is the inspiratory pause button, and give it about for half a second, check the plateau pressure. Your goal for plateau pressure should be less than equal to 30. This will reduce your ventilator-induced lung injury. If plateau pressure is more than 30, you reduce your tidal volume. If you started your tidal volume at 8, you can reduce by 1 ml per kg gradually to target a plateau pressure of less than 30. If plateau pressure is less than 25, and your tidal volume is less than 6 ml, you could go up on your tidal volume. So this is how you titrate your tidal volume based on your plateau pressure. Plateau pressure is nothing but a target of how much your alveoli is getting distended. And plateau pressure will reflect the compliance of the lung. So the higher the plateau pressure, it means the compliance of the lung is very poor. If the compliance is very good, your plateau pressure is going to be low. So it has been noted that in these COVID patients, the compliance has been not so bad as compared to other etiology of ARDS that they have seen. So the oxygenation goal here is where we set up peak. So you need to target a PaO2 of 55 to 80. So PaO2 means you need a ABG analysis every 6 hourly or 8 hourly at least. If not, you will have to go by your saturation, which should be anything above 88. You don't need to reach 100, 95% is sufficient. You have different PEEP tables. These are freely available. So you set your PEEP and FiO2 accordingly. Don't push up the FiO2 to 100 and keep a PEEP that is low, nor keep a very high PEEP and an FiO2 that is low. So you will have to balance the PEEP and FiO2 based on the tables that are provided. So what they have noticed that in these COVID patients, a higher PEEP and lower FiO2 is what is favorable. They respond well to higher PEEP. So your pH goal is where you set your respiratory rate and your tidal volume. So your pH goal should be between 7.3 to 7.45. You don't want it to be too alkalotic or too acidemic. So if the pH is less than 7.3, you push up the rate up to 35. If the pH continues to be low, you start pushing up on the tidal volume by 1 ml per kg. So this is given in ARDSNet. It's taken from the ARDSNet. Very easy to follow. Just download the table, keep it at the bedside. That's how we do in our institute. And the nurse themselves check the ARDSNet protocol, and they know how much to push the PEEP and FiO2 to. So you could keep this at the bedside as a very good reckoner. If the patient has moderate to severe ARDS, you need to consider proning, especially in this COVID-19 patients. They have found the proning is very, very helpful, helps in recruiting the recruited alveoli. We consider PaO to FiO2 ratio less than 150, considered to prone. I don't know how many facilities will be comfortable in proning, and they should have the experience, the manpower, and the nurses should be comfortable to nurse them in the prone position, because it is manpower consumptive, the proning sessions. So you will have to prone these patients for at least 12 hours and above on an everyday basis, giving sessions of break in supination to give the back care and to reduce the pressure source on the face. So what are the steps for proning? So this is something that I got from, not from an Indian website, nor do we have any proning videos that I could show. So you need 5 people, 2 on either side, and 1 doctor at the head end to hold the airway. Next, the person at the airway holds the airway. Pillows are kept on the patient, two pillows are kept on the patient. A bedsheet is placed over the patient, and the bedsheet is rolled on both sides, and the patient is prone. So the pillow comes onto the chest of the patient, chest and leg of the patient. And the patient is kept in this prone position with suctioning and feeding that continues in this prone position for 12 hours and above. With saturation being maintained, the patient can be deproned. Some very important points to remember is early proning is advisable in these COVID-19 patients. You need expertise and manpower to prone, and nursing in prone position is needed. Proning for more than 12 hours duration, and contraindications for proning as any raised intracranial pressure, spine instability, patients in shock. Proning is not advisable. So how do you collect a sample for an endotracheal sample, either for culture or even for COVID-19? So this is our institute protocol. So you put the patient on a suction support of 100%, wait for a minute. Do you see the catheter mount? I'm sure you would have all seen, and when a patient is intubated, this catheter mount is on the patient, which connects it to the ventilator. There is a small opening on the catheter mount. So you stop the ventilator, open the catheter mount, the small opening, and then insert a Ryle's tube with a syringe attached, instill saline and aspirate. This is nothing but your mini bag. Remove the Ryle's tube, keep it in a tray, dispose the sheet. If you have covered it under a sheet so that you reduce aerosolization, close the catheter mount, and then you start the ventilation. So this will prevent aerosolization. Then you can use this material that you have collected, and you can use it for culture, or you could send it for the viral media for COVID testing. Coming to the general ICU management, I have mentioned about the ventilator management. Another very, very important thing is the general ICU management. Enteral nutrition through oro and nasogastric tube to meet the daily calorie requirement. Prophylaxis to prevent DVT. Prevent hospital-acquired infections, so you continue to use your HICC bundles. Stress ulcer prophylaxis, glucose control. Prevent pressure ulcers by frequent turning of the patient. And early mobilization also will help in prevention of pressure ulcers. Next step is, once you have successfully managed the patient with ARDS and the patient has started to improve, you will have to have a written weaning protocol also in place. you will have this guidelines that I have given here is based on experience. You could use your own targets to start your weaning protocol. Paralytics can be stopped if your FiO2 is less than 60%, PEEP is less than 12, and patient is maintaining saturation above 95%. If after stopping paralytics, patient starts desaturating, you may be forced to restart paralytic infusion. Have a plan to slowly reduce your FiO2 and PEEP according to your PEEP FiO2 table in a gradual manner over hours to days. Avoid drastic reduction in PEEP. It will cause de-recruitment of alveoli and severe hypoxia. All your efforts in recruiting your alveoli will be lost. Once FiO2 is down to 40% and PEEP is less than 6, he's maintaining saturation, it is time to start weaning the patient. You can put CPAP with pressure support for weaning. You don't need to put the patient on SIMV. You can go straight away to CPAP with pressure support for weaning. So here again, this is our protocol for extubation. Because the patient may still be shedding the virus, you have to be very cautious when you want to extubate the patient. Put the patient on 100% FiO2 before extubation. Explain the procedure to the patient. Tell him not to cough violently when you are extubating. Gently suction the ET tube and the oral cavity. Stand by, put the ventilator and stand by. Disconnect after a few seconds. Don't disconnect immediately. Deflate the cuff with a single shot. Deflate the cuff with a 10 ml syringe and remove the ET tube and put the patient quickly on O2 mask. This is ways to prevent aerosolization. Keep minimum people in the room to avoid exposure with adequate PPE. Remember, the patient is still not COVID negative, so you will have to still treat him as a COVID positive, although he might have improved clinically. So coming to the drug therapy, which is what many of us would also be interested. Empirical antibiotics need to be started as for any community-acquired pneumonia. Oseltamivir, if you are suspecting H1N1 or the reports, until the reports come. Corticosteroids have been generally, many studies have shown it is better to avoid corticosteroids in these patients. But if the patient has been on corticosteroids before, better to continue to use as a stress dose. Coming to the specific therapy, this is from our national guidelines. Hydroxychloroquine 400 mg BD on day 1, followed by 200 BD for 4 days oral. Azithromycin 500 mg OD for 5 days. Both of these studies have shown that the viral shedding has decreased with the combination of both these drugs. And it is the drug of choice to be recommended even in a COVID suspect, severely ill COVID suspect. Even before the report comes, it is advisable to start the patients on this combination. But you have to remember that this combination can predispose to QT prolongation. You have to dose adjust HCQ based on renal or hepatic failure. Antivirals which are available in our country is your ritonavir with lopinavir combination. The oral tablet is 2 tablets that you will have to give BD for 14 days or 7 days after becoming asymptomatic, whichever is earlier. But you should remember, when you're crushing and administering the tablets, this decreases the absorption by 50%. So sometimes it may be better to use suspension instead of tablets if you're going to crush and give it through the rice tube. No renal dose modification is needed, but you will have to be careful in patients with hepatic impairment and medications that are contraindicated with these drug combination, especially rifampicin, benzodiazepine, simvastatin, voriconazole, and sildenafil. This combination has to be avoided. If the patient is already receiving other HIV medication, better to avoid this combination. So it is contraindicated in severe cardiac and liver disease. So because of so many drug interactions, that is why the HCQ with azithromycin is the recommended drug of choice. Thank you.
There is a question. Why can't we give HCQ?
And this is our question only.
See, HCQ is a drug which is approved for the treatment of severe patients as per national guidelines. And we have to remember that HCQ has other indications as well. We have to remember that HCQ has side effects as well. So mild symptomatic patients who are going to recover without treatment, there is no need to panic and give HCQ.
What is the exact thing is, when ICMR has suggested for prophylaxis, So in a case of prophylaxis who are health
workers or
asymptomatic co-workers or doctors have been suggested prophylaxis for HCQ. So our question was, why can't we give it in mild symptomatic? That was the question we discussed in our group. So I will again, this thought came to us when patients' samples came continuously positive.
Even after 14?
Even after reports, even of 14, 15 days. So we started them on HCQ at these mild cases. So 5 patients turned out to be negative
After this.
after this. So
Maybe
we have changed certain guidelines in our level, saying that why can't it be started at mild cases? So this is our
question.
our inference. Like,
So we'll have to.
No, I think a persistent positivity indicates persistent infectivity. If it is lagging behind, if there is a discordance between viral positivity and clinical improvement, then I still will not give HCQ. I'll probably
this is only mild.
reduce the viral shedding.
That's what I'm saying. It is, if there is a lag, it prevents transmission. But as far as patient is concerned, we are giving him a drug.
Next question.
Virus is a non-living outside the body. So why is it with the life of virus on surface?
The problem is virus is a time bomb. It will be dormant on the surface.
But
The moment it finds a host, it
will
activates.
activate.
So you have, for as long as it's in the dormant state,
Still a.
yeah, as long as it's a dormant volcano, you have to clean it. If it becomes extinct, then it's not a problem. That's the problem with viruses. They just wait for the host. That's why you have to keep cleaning surfaces.
Role of anticoagulation ARDS.
So this anticoagulant therapy came about because of microthrombosis that were mentioned in some of the autopsy cases. But to our little bit experience that we have had, we have not seen any form of a severe thrombotic episode till now. Yeah, so I'm not sure. This is only a single center experience that I'm mentioning of the very few cases that we have managed. Probably if we start getting to see and more autopsy from India, which is showing that this is what is the pathophysiology of this COVID-19 in our country, maybe we may need to consider. But that is only not from our subcontinent, it's from other areas that has been reported. So I would still not suggest anticoagulant therapy in ARDs.
But most of the time, the anticoagulant therapy is given as a part of prophylaxis for DVT.
DVT. This is anticoagulant therapy.
It is not
therapy
therapeutic.
is
It's
not,
not therapeutic.
the same as prophylaxis.
Maybe we have to do 1 or 2 autopsies.
That is what. Until
So
Again, it is difficult to extrapolate because there is so much heterogeneity. If you look at global data, they are talking of an L phenotype, a H phenotype, and microthrombotic and a hemorrhage, infarct kind of phenotype. So we don't know. It's very difficult to generalize and say anticoagulants.
Maybe are the only severe cases like you like patients who are on ventilators, severe ARDS patients. Maybe we have to do autopsy and it's not possible.
But again, you won't be wiser for the next patient. Those with severe ARDS again cannot be imaged. We can't demonstrate them.
No harm versus treatment. Like if you give treatment for 1 or 2 days, like therapeutic dose of.
Actually, any intervention at the end of the disease spectrum will not show you results.
Yeah, exactly.
We are already dipping. So
you may have a multifactorial cause for the microthrombosis. You may not be able to pinpoint to say it is because of the COVID-19.
Next question regarding, I think so you already answered this. Regarding steroid, won't it be helpful to start steroid as it's more of a cytokine storm? Some studies suggest immunomodulators.
Yes, immunomodulators in case of if you have markers which show that there is a cytokine storm. So you have facilities to measure cytokines, you measure ferritin levels that are showing a continuous increase in trend, increase in CRP, then probably you would think of immunomodulators. But some of the major chunk of studies that have come shown that steroids in these subset of patients with ARDS has not found to be useful. So if you have facilities to check serial level of ferritin or any other immune markers, then it would be advisable then to start steroids or even other immunomodulator therapy. Otherwise, that is, we are looking at a secondary HLH. That is the condition where you may need to think of steroids and other immunomodulators. Otherwise, steroids not suggested for this group of patients with ARDS.
The next question is, can we start the drug one after the other? That's azithromycin, then followed by HCQ.
it is advisable to give both together because that is what is found to have benefit. But if the patient is in the ICU, you have a continuous ECG monitoring. That is the benefit of giving both together, and you could monitor rather than an OPD or a ward patient where you may not have a continuous ECG monitoring.
So, Madam, in this regard, can we time the administration so that we avoid the peaking of the drugs, simultaneous peaking of drugs? Maybe that
could
might
also
be helpful, probably. We can time the administration.
But HCQ lasts. The
that's correct.
effect
But the
is
peak,
much,
we can.
Even azithromycin has a significant post effect, and so it's given once a day. So it may be very difficult in a critical setting to say what cost.
Considering the damage to the alveoli, it's been argued that hyperbaric oxygen therapy is a better management strategy than ventilator management.
Hyperbaric oxygen, no, there has been no role.
No role.
But high flow nasal cannula in improving, in recruiting alveoli has been shown, may be considered in settings where the patients, where the experience with ventilator management may not be there, then maybe we need to have more high flow nasal cannula. But as I mentioned, isolated room with good, distance, air exchanges are very important.
Role of high flow nasal oxygen with NIV before putting a patient on invasive.
NIV, if you're going to have NIV, those machines where your expiratory limb has got a filter, bacteria and a viral filter, with a good fitting full face mask, you can still use, but very low threshold for intubation, because all previous studies in other NIV settings also, the main reason for increased mortality was delay in intubation. So you can give a trial of NIV again in a isolated room with very few personnel. So because aerosolization, I keep emphasizing on that. If you do not have adequate PPE, that is something that we need to be worried about if you're going to use NIV and high flow nasal cannula.
Another thing is that please do not use domiciliary NIV for this. You need an inspiratory and expiratory limb. Like Dr. Bhuwana said, you need a filter. Don't pick up your CPAP and BiPAP machines and use them to ventilate these patients.
You need separate limbs. Like in your regular ventilator, you can use the NIV mode where the expiratory limb with a filter can be attached.
Yeah, Dr. Sudesh, can you tell more about high flow nasal oxygen?
Actually, with our minimal experience, we had like a few patients whose P/O to FiO2 ratio was around 150 to start with, 150 between 100 and 150 to start with. However, because of some limiting factors, we had to put them on high flow nasal, and of course, we were having continuous monitoring for the first initial 1 hour or 2 hours. So we thought we just take that, and we were ready for intubation in our patients. But somehow the patients pulled on with high flow nasal, and eventually, every hourly we were just constantly seeing the patient when the patients maintained oxygenation for some 3-4 days. But subsequently, gradually, of course, here the very thing affected was, the patient was continuously monitored. That was the baseline.
That's very, very
important. That is the baseline. So since the patients were continuously monitored, we took that calculated risk of going with that, and we ensured that the area is very well ventilated, and we did not switch on the AC. All the windows, actually for this purpose, we have converted our ICU into negative pressure ICU, where we put exhaust fans around 20 to 25 exhaust fans to make it negative pressure. And we took all those precautions, and the person who was entering wore full-fledged PPE to the level that they were suffocating. So
that's very, very important.
So that with that backup, I think we started with this one. In addition to this, what we had kept a threshold was if the flow went up beyond the flow requirement went up beyond 50 liters per minute, and if FiO2 requirement went above 60, then we thought we are going to intervene, and we are going to. So that's what we were keeping in mind. Of course, this again has got one background for why we chose high flow nasal oxygen. That was because when we went through the literature, it is in one of the small literature, it is mentioned that the distance of aerosol spread is up to 1 feet, even with high flow nasal cannula, provided the patient is not coughing. The patient doesn't have cough, then the distance of aerosol spread can go up to 330 millimeters. That's what they mentioned. So if anything beyond that, So the thing was, we gave the advice to the healthcare providers was that they have to maintain a distance of at least 1.5 feet from the patient, and the patients were they were trained to place the nasal cannula as and when it got discharged. So for the first time itself, they were trained how to keep them, and they were motivated that if they keep that one, they can avoid ventilator. So much of this one, that means we should be very cautious. Vijay Kumar sir, you want?
Over that, like iflo-nasal oxygen cannula, you can put a simple mask.
Yeah, of course, that also.
And they improved with like maybe for first 6 to almost 6 hours to 1 day, symptoms became much better actually.
Yeah, next question is, two studies suggesting hypoxemia also due to an acquired hemoglobinopathy and utility of blood transfusion plasmapheresis. What is your take on this?
Yeah, this is also not from our centers. It's all from, we have not yet seen these type of cases to suggest even plasmapheresis. Yes, but we need to keep it in mind when hopefully, we don't want to see a stage where we're going to have cases with different spectra of disease, like a hemoglobinopathy or a microthrombosis. But we need to keep it in mind to consider when cases come like this with complications.
Are there guidelines for screening of donors for COVID-19? As of now, no. Testing mandatory before operative procedure?
Yes. As per the Indian Society of Guidelines, they have placed a position statement saying that we have decided upon a point questionnaire or a 6-point system where we go through the patient's history, and a patient who has got history of close contact or patient who has got history of upper respiratory tract infection has to, many times, as madam told, that many patients do not reveal. Actually, there are some 2 or 3 instances where the patient underwent orthopedic surgery without revealing the history of travel, and ended up infecting the orthopedic surgeon as well as the anesthesia team. So it's very important that there should be a proper history taking where they have to find various ways to elicit the history of travel or elicit the history of contact, and based on that, if they fall into that high risk category, they have to be tested for COVID-19, and preferably please avoid elective procedures or any procedures which has to be done under general anesthesia, and those procedures which require laparoscopy. Wherever possible, try to do procedures only when that is indicated, and preferably use regional anesthesia when compared to general anesthesia, and also avoid laparoscopy wherever possible, and try to go on to open procedures rather than going for laparoscopy.
Before that, there is a question.
Yeah.
Dr. Archana,
Yes, sir.
you can ask your question.
It is about the possibility of having a naturally ventilated ICU instead of closed ICU with AC.
Yes.
Yes, that is a very good possibility.
Because in India,
Is it possible, and is it better?
Better, definitely.
better if
Am
you
I
have.
audible?
Yes.
See, most of our
Hello?
Yeah, you've done your question. Now the answer will come. Please.
Most of our ACs don't meet the requirements of 10 to 12 air exchanges. In that case, so it is better to have a good cross-ventilated ICU. Much better than an AC which is not meeting the demands of 10 to 12 air exchanges or negative pressure. I hope that answers your question.
Next question is, what are the disinfectants to be used in ICU?
Similar to any other ward, nothing specific, sodium hypochlorite,
And, yeah.
chlorhexidine, and even your Ashacart that we used. That is, so many
Bacillol
names are there.
yeah.
Bacillocid, Cidex, so many names are there. You can use any of those.
What is the role of prophylaxis in healthcare workers?
As per ICMR guidelines, we have to offer.
We have to offer.
It's already been offered.
Frontline high-risk healthcare
Discussed.
workers. So you will have to offer, and it is the personal choice to take it on.
Role of propofol in intubation. Already discussed. Yeah.
Preferably not to use when there is hypotension.
Hypotensions.
Role of BCG vaccinations.
Still, no, the final word is not out. Yes.
I think he is asking like BCG vaccinated is like a protective.
We don't know.
We don't know yet,
We don't know.
because there are more number of patients who are still having disease. In that case, actually, the number of incidents should not have gone up in India,
Yeah.
but still it's going up. That means
It's unclear.
offer
Role of
is
BCG is still unclear.
unclear.
Next is there any perfect combination of drug therapy?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Whatever is there, we have to use.
Why ICMR relaxed BSL for COVID TrueNat testing. This is still on very recently, probably yesterday only TrueNat has come. This is under discussion. Probably it is not relaxed. You will know the answer probably in a day or two. Any follow-up guideline after discharge of patient from hospital, like repeat PCR at 14 days of post-discharge?
Again, it is not clear.
It's not clear.
It is not clear. Nobody has
See, follow-up, what I would try to tell is follow-up. Usually what we are trying to tell our patients is, we are trying to quarantine, instead of 14 days, we are making it 28 days for the quarantine. So there is possibility of viral discharge even at day 37, 38. So when keeping in future, or we may be overcautious. That is one reason we are trying to ask them to come back after 28 days. Probably after 28 days comes, we need to get depending upon the symptoms, we may have to get a CT scan done. We may have to get a spirometry done. Usually what we have learned in the previous places, what it is, there's some fibrosis happening following the COVID infection. So keeping this in mind, it can present as an ILD. So that has to be taken into consideration. What about the relapse? There are so many reasons for relapses. We really do not know. Probably some say it is because of the testing, wrong testing, or a reinfection or reactivation. So as of now, we are not seen in India. Relapse and reactivation, the next question also, we still yet to see.
No, I think we again have to reiterate that the target now is to find cases, treat them, isolate them, and prevent spread. Then we will not be answering we will not come across a situation where relapse or reactivation happens.
Yeah, that is very important.
Yeah, and quarantine for adequate period. Repeated testing, you might get positive, negative, because apart from the viral load, the sampling technique is also important. So it is possible that it's a false negative. So you go by clinical criteria, make sure the patient is non-infective. To our knowledge, we know that 37, 35 days is the limit. We are already doing 14 plus 14. So repeated testing, again, you'll be using up resources. Guidelines have to come out for repeated testing.
What's the role of
ACE2 inhibitors?
ACE inhibitors, as of now, we have no
answer.
They can
continue.
The patient is on ACE.
It was already there in my talk. You can continue ACE.
Yeah, it is very clearly mentioned.
In a suspected case of swab test is negative.
Once it is negative and they continue to be symptomatic.
Yes.
Is there a reason to repeat the swab? Again, there's no guideline. It's a clinical decision. If you strongly suspect and you think your first sample is false negative, you can repeat it with enough justification.
Yeah, only if you're symptomatic, you can go for repeat test. How often should chest X-ray be repeated in a patient with COVID with pulmonary infection? Madam?
X-ray better because you are exposing more people to the patient. So X-ray should not even be used as a criteria for making the diagnosis of COVID. If you have lung ultrasound, some institutes use lung ultrasound to look for the lung involvement. Better to continue to use lung ultrasound. You can use a baseline X-ray. No need for repeated X-ray to monitor for increasing infiltrates. It's a case-to-case basis. You want to repeat an X-ray, you can repeat. Considering the risks that will be involved in the X-ray to the radiographers.
This question is already answered.
It's already answered.
Any role of tocilizumab or IVIG?
Again, if you can monitor IL-6 levels and it's a desperate situation and you get the tocilizumab, yes, you can use it, but it's again not there in the guidelines. There are many ifs between your decision and giving.
We are talking about again HLH here, IVIG, plasma exchange or tocilizumab. If you can prove and if these drugs are available, you could consider. And even probably in that case, first steroids would be the
first. Yeah,
rather than going straight away for these.
Can you please put note on herd immunity? When can we expect a vaccine?
Your guess is as good as ours. It's happening. That's all.
How to create a negative pressure in ICU? Places like Gulbarga, temperature is nearly 40 degrees, difficult to work without AC. Dr. Sudesh.
Yes, this question was specifically directed. Even I've come across this question quite time because in Ballari also there's a problem they're facing. What I would suggest is you, as far as possible, preferably use a naturally ventilated ICU and preferably design the ICU in such a place like where you can have less amount of heat. For example, instead of having an ICU in a topmost floor of the hospital, you can have it in a second or first floor where the amount of impact of heat from the outside surrounding temperature is reduced. And second thing is you keep all the windows open because you want a good amount of cross ventilation. So that is one more way we can understand. Regarding the use of AC, it's again difficult. Fine. Okay, it is difficult to say whether you have to use AC or not, because AC, most of the places, they don't have centralized AC with a HEPA filter. There is one thing that if we have a portable HEPA filter, probably use of AC might be useful. But again, procuring a HEPA filter has got its own practical difficulties. So the best way is to have a naturally ventilated ICU. The other way is what we have done in our ICU, as per from our intensivist perspective, we have put lot of exhaust fans in the windows. So we have made small holes in the windows, and we have put an exhaust fan which will drive out the air whatever is getting collected in the chamber. So that is one of the ways you can at least try to bring down the temperature in the ICU. That's the way what we are doing now.
A role of ivermectin.
Final answer, not out. Anecdotal reports are there. Wouldn't recommend right now.
What about false negative cases?
We answered this.
Role of iron chelating agents.
Answered.
Known case of QT prolongation. Any other drug to treat the COVID-19?
We have to think of the antivirals then.
Yeah.
Whether post-COVID-19 can cause COPD?
No, we don't know.
Wait for 1 month.
Yeah, wait for a few months.
I'm working at a PHC where we almost has no OP, but I drive for 25 kilometers on a bike in Hyderabad. How should I take measure to keep me and my family members safe? Almost has no.
Wear a mask whenever you travel, or practice social distancing, hand cleansing, probably a shower every day before you leave the hospital.
Yeah, twice a day.
Things I can think of.
Yeah, I think that much. And try to avoid carrying various things like watches, because if you anything, jewelry, watches, belts, you can avoid all those things, wearing those things to the hospitals, and carry what is most important. You can carry few currency notes or else maybe one credit card or something. So that you can carry all those things. You can avoid carrying all those things which is not necessary to go to a hospital. So that is one way you can reduce the incidence of transmission to your family.
A question to Madam. Quarantine guidelines for healthcare workers, especially or exposed to aerosol with a protected...
If they have worn the complete PPE, they have been exposed to an aerosol procedure, there is no need for quarantine. If you have taken proper precautions during your doping procedure, have a shower, I don't think you need to take any quarantine, but it is recommended that after a period of COVID duties, you are given adequate break to release the stress. It reduces your infection, you're prone for chances for infection, and then you come back to non-COVID duties. That is what is recommended. Yeah. Otherwise, you don't need to quarantine or you don't need to be swabbed.
Yeah, what I can tell is what we are doing in our institute is we have placed our doctors in a separate hospital. People who are on duty for the next 7 days, whether it is doctors, staff nurse, and group Ds, are placed in a separate hospital where every 6 hours they finish their duty, come back to the ward where they're going to stay overnight. And 7 days after they complete the 7 days of duty, they've been quarantined in hotels for next 14 days. This is what we are following in our institute.
So again, what I would like to reiterate at this point from all your questions is that we are getting to know the virus now. The government is working hard, and there are a lot of guidelines which are available on the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare website. Please stick to the guidelines. We have not reached a stage where we can try experimental therapies or flout the guidelines. After all, testing is being done by the government. We are reporting back to them. Let's please follow guidelines, which was what was emphasized in my presentation also. And please take, reinforcement is always important. Please go back, revisit the course. You can take the courses on iGot. You can look at the videos posted on the RGHS website. So please keep reinforcing your knowledge, and let's hope to beat the virus.
We are running short of time. Any questions through your whatever you sent will be answered.
Research is coming. The
Sorry?
last question should be answered, sir. I think that's relevant.
I will take one question. Last question.
Research is coming on a new device which enables single ventilators to be shared between multiple patients. So I think in extreme emergencies,
So even in a severe ARDS patient with single ventilator, it's very difficult to manage. I don't think
Not advised.
Not advised.
Not advised.
Yeah, we end the session here.
Last.
Sumari.
Three more.
Huh? Okay. Yeah.
in coming days, it's better to avoid intubation in ER, emergency room, shift immediately to designated area, avoid spread to healthcare workers. Well, shall I take?
Yeah.
So as per protocol, we have decided that all the patients who develop impending respiratory distress be shifted to ICU or orange zone or high dependency unit where there is proper expertise and adequate equipment supply to ensure that the intubation is done in a safe manner. So that if you can plan that will be the best thing. We prefer to shift before the patient goes into a dire situation where he has to be intubated in the place where he is. So shift the high risk patients to the intensive care or high dependency unit. So therefore, we can avoid spread of infection to other healthcare workers. AHU unit.
You can take.
AHU unit with HEPA filter with negative pressure can be used in Gulbarga with high temperature. But not every institute will be designed to have that. That is the best thing.
Can we use vitamin C as a treatment module for COVID-19? We have been using vitamin C in all our patients. This is there. Vitamin C, zinc has been there.
Again, guidelines do not recommend, but again, it's counterintuitive. These are agents which help when there's oxidative stress, so might help. We don't have literature.
When do you start that?
Immediately. Day one.
Is there any association between Guillain-Barré syndrome and COVID-19? One case has been reported. One case has been reported.
It can't be called an association.
Yeah.
Anecdotal again.
Do we need to take HCQs?
Already answered.
Prophylaxis.
Already answered, sir.
Is it recommended to use PPE in fever clinic or only N95 mask with gloves is sufficient?
N95 mask, gloves, probably with surgical scrubs is enough. If you're sitting across and talking to a patient, you don't need full PPE.
We end the session here. I request Dr. Sachinananda, Honorable Vice Chancellor, to give the concluding remarks.
Yeah, I'm sure all of you have gone through the presentations by the experts here, and most of your doubts would have been cleared. I can see a lot of questions even being raised at this point of time. As Dr. Bona told, and Uma mentioned, told that reinforcement is always necessary for us. How much ever we know, every patient is a challenge for us. Every patient throws new challenges, so we need to keep updating ourselves and managing cases as per their presentations. And as I mentioned, the guidelines keep changing. COVID-19 is a very dynamic disease. All of us are going through that for the first time. So every day the guidelines keep changing. So it's always better to be updated, keep reading, keep discussing with your colleagues. And for your information, one tele-ICU center has been started by Government of Karnataka. It is housed in Ananda Circle. This tele-ICU would monitor all severe cases and are likely to be going to be severe cases, like moderate cases worsening to severe cases, and also cases in ICU. All these cases will be monitored from Bangalore. And we have started a 24/7 tele-ICU center where interns will be sitting there and getting all the inputs from all various peripheral centers. And in turn, they'll be in contact with experts here in Bangalore who have volunteered to give their time and expertise and opinion to just give that a little more edge to whatever you have been doing there. Not that you are not competent enough. It is only to see that all of us are on the same page of as treatment is concerned. We follow the guidelines, we stick to the guidelines. And in case there are any difficulties, if you come across, that will be solved here. You can always escalate your problem to the experts here. And collectively, we would be looking at reaching what is called a zero mortality. We should not lose even one single patient. And that is the motto, that should be the motto. And there should not be any egos here, any sort of clashes. Let us always be, there's nothing wrong in taking a second opinion or a third opinion whenever the problem is there, whenever a situation arises. With that in mind, this program was specifically designed to address a problem or reiterate the guidelines for Hyderabad, Karnataka and Belgaum division. And we will continue to do such programs. I hope it was useful to you. In case you have some more doubts, please escalate the doubts to us. We're always there to answer that. Okay, with this, we'll be signing off today at this point of time. Thank you so much for being with us. And be rest assured that whatever your problem may be, we are always there to answer your questions. Thank you so much.